Good evening. This is Donna Blomquist, librarian at the LaSalle Public Library. Welcome to tonight's program, Godspeed, John Glenn, the historic flight of Friendship 7. Before we begin, just a few programming reminders. On July 26th at 6 p.m. Central Time, join us for a virtual Zoom presentation, The Hollywood Blockbuster, How Steven Spielberg and George Lucas Changed the Movies. Brian Rose, Professor Emeritus at Fordham University, will present 4 decades of filmmaking by these two entertainment and artistic giants. As always, all programming is free and open to the public. It is also shareable, so please feel free to pass the information on to others. Tonight, we welcome NASA Solar System Ambassador Scott Pelican. We are very pleased to have such a NASA enthusiast right here in LaSalle. Like so many of us of a certain age, Scott has been awestruck by the U.S. space program from the very earliest days. Tonight, Scott will take us back to those early days in 1962 when John Glenn completed his historic flight to become the first American to orbit the Earth. Rachel here at the library will be advancing the slides. And now I'll close my mic and turn the program over to Scott. As always, please post your questions in the chat. We want to hear from you. Scott, welcome. Well, we need to unmute Scott.
How about now?
That works better.
Okay.
Welcome.
We could never get to the moon, you and I, Donna, that's for sure. Thank goodness we have Rachel in mission control for us tonight.
Yeah, I'm always thinking that myself.
Yeah, well, thank you, Donna, and thanks everyone at the LaSalle Public Library. Again, it's great to be here, and thanks to all of you who are listening in tonight on the John Glenn program. And yes, it's terrific to be a solar system ambassador. I joined the program beginning of this year and was accepted in early January. And I immediately had an idea in my head about doing a John Glenn program, knowing that on February 20th of this year, we would have been celebrating the 60th anniversary of the historic flight. As it turned out, with my NASA training, I wasn't allowed to actually go out and seek some sort of programs until almost the beginning of February. And I called Donna then, but of course it was much too late to try to throw a program together by February 20th. But Donna came up with a great idea that perhaps we could do it now, July 19th. And her reasoning is that yesterday was the anniversary of John Glenn's birthday. He was born July 18th, 1921. So we'd be celebrating his 101st birthday. So it worked out fine that we could wrap it around a Glenn anniversary for sure. So it was a great idea from Donna, and it gave me some time to do some research on this amazing life and this amazing American hero, that's for sure. And also we have another anniversary, another space anniversary that comes up tomorrow being July 20th. Of course, is the anniversary of the Apollo moon landing, Apollo 11, with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. I believe we're at the 53rd anniversary tomorrow. So anniversaries going on all around here. So I'll be doing some narrative in this program along with the slides that Rachel's handling. So I again thank you very much for joining in, and hope you'll bear with me through the presentation tonight. So Rachel, if you're ready, I certainly am, that's for sure. I think if we go to the first slide. So John Glenn had one more in him, for sure, after an amazing and phenomenal life. On October 29th, 1998, he became the oldest person at that time to venture into space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. It was perhaps the culmination of a life given again to his country, a life not only exemplary, but truly phenomenal. And we'll look at a few of those highlights right now first. Rachel, if you would, please. John Glenn married the only girl he ever dated, Annie Castro. Annie and John's parents were friends, and often the friends would get together and put the babies in a playpen. So John and Andy actually were in playpens together as babies. And then they spent more than 70 years together as husband and wife. Again, Annie was the only girl that John Glenn ever dated. Truly a remarkable marriage. John Glenn was a devout Presbyterian, spending much of his life teaching Sunday school. He followed patriotism and responsibility to his country as his guiding star in life. Rachel, if you would, please. After December 7th, 1941, he left Muskingum College to join the Marines. In the Marines, he flew a total of 149 combat missions during World War II and the Korean War, receiving multiple medals and decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross 6 times. He met Charles Lindbergh, whose name will come up a couple times tonight. He met Lindbergh during the First World War. And during the Korean War, his bunkmate and flying wingman was Baseball Hall of Famer Ted Williams, believe it or not. Williams was incredibly impressed with John Glenn. He called him crazy, not in a crazy kind of way, in more of a wartime crazy kind of way, that he was willing to do anything it took in the air. He called Glenn his idol and the bravest SOB he ever met. War was hard for Glenn, like for all men, but he was an incredible pilot. His pilot mates would always remember he would come up alongside them in the air and dip his wing underneath theirs and give him a little tap on the wing. He was an amazing pilot. He also, of course, led many firebombing missions in Korea and in the Pacific during World War II. And he also led some of the first napalm attacks. He didn't have a lust for war. He simply was doing his duty to country. And he had a theory that it was to destroy or be destroyed. He lost one of his best friends in combat. He was flying next to him and suddenly he was gone. And that really affected Glenn. He came home from war, like all men who went off to war, a changed man for sure. Rachel, if we could. Here's John Glenn in Project Bullet. After returning from war, he set a speed record flying from Los Angeles to New York in 3 hours and 23 minutes. It made him a national celebrity, even before Friendship 7. Earned him a spot on many TV shows, including TV game shows, where he would show up in his sharp Marine uniform. Rachel, if you would, please. And of course, he was selected as one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, along with Gus Grissom, Gordon Cooper, Deke Slayton, Al Shepard, Wally Schirra, and Scott Carpenter. They were named on April 9th of 1959. He was the oldest member of the group, and in the end, he was the last surviving member of the group. And then he soared into space to become the first American to orbit Earth. Rachel, if you would, please. And there's Glenn in his astronaut outfit. After the flight and after NASA, he became the president of Royal Crown Cola Company. He also became a close personal friend of Robert F. Kennedy. And he was the person left to tell Robert Kennedy's children that their father had been murdered on the night he died, as he happened to be with the family that night. Rachel, if you would. He, of course, served as a United States Senator from Ohio for more than 2 decades, becoming the most popular politician in the history of the state. The awards, the medals, the commendations are too many to even mention. Naval ships, airports, schools, of course, were named after him. As he flew on the space shuttle, his Marine buzz cut replaced by a bald head and some graying, America still looked at him and saw a hero. It was a truly phenomenal life that John Glenn led. But it was the flight of Friendship 7, of course, that made John Glenn the hero he was. Rachel, if you would, please. 3 months after John Glenn set his transcontinental speed record in July of 1957, the USSR put Sputnik satellite into space. And 4 days after the achievement, Glenn, now a national celebrity, appeared on the TV game show Name That Tune. The host asked him, "What do you think of the Russian satellite?" And Glenn said, "Well, to say the least, they're out of this world." The line that was probably written for him. But he added that this was really quite an advancement, noting that this is probably the first step towards space travel or moon travel. Rachel, if you would. The president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, was not as impressed as Glenn was. He mocked the Russian feat. They put up one small ball in the air, he said. He couldn't understand why the American people had gotten so worked up about this thing. It's certainly not going to drop on their heads. But this was a losing argument at this time for Eisenhower. America had gained a national panic over the Sputnik satellite. Physicist Edward Teller was quoted as saying that America has lost a battle more important than Pearl Harbor. Now, Eisenhower wasn't against exploring the cosmos. By all means, he wrote, we must carry on our explorations in space. He just simply believed that engaging with the Russians in a space race was too costly with little strategic gain. However, NASA was created during the Eisenhower administration and gains in the space program were made. Conversely, in his last space meeting before leaving office, Eisenhower said he couldn't care less whether a man ever reached the moon. After the meeting, he slashed NASA's request for post-Mercury research from 23 million to 1 million. It was his last word on space. Now, in Eisenhower's defense, at the time, he was a president who actually cared about balanced budgets and spending. Hard to believe these days, whether we're talking about a current Republican president or a Democratic president. And Kennedy was much the same way. We'll see. These were political times when balanced budgets and spending was being weighed against the progress we were making in space. There have been some books written trying to burnish Eisenhower's image as it relates to space, but he has many quotes where you can tell that he wasn't all that impressed with getting involved in a space race at that time. Again, a lot of it, though, going back to his concerns for spending that reflected many different ways in Eisenhower's administration. So then we're on to the presidential election of 1960. And there's many historical records that show that John Kennedy was equally as skeptical about the cost of space as compared to the actual security risks and scientific benefits it may provide. But politically, Kennedy was much more adept at the politics of things. He was facing Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, in the campaign of 1960. And he used the space race as a political advantage. He accused the Eisenhower administration and also Nixon, therefore, as his vice president, of being adrift on space policy and hammered Nixon on the missile gap and national security. Rachel, if you would. This is Nixon with Nikita Khrushchev at an exhibition of American goods in Moscow. And Nixon famously told Khrushchev there that maybe the Soviets have better rockets than the United States, but we have better color TVs. Of course, a statement that would haunt him in the election. And Kennedy, of course, quoted Nixon all the way through the election for his comments there. This was the coldest time of the Cold War, if you would. In January of that year, Alan Shepard was selected as the first astronaut to go into space. And this did not sit well with John Glenn, of course. He was furious about it. He thought he would be the first man in space, and he fought hard for that decision. The space program was continuing and moving forward. Glenn was very upset about Shepard being chosen, but the decision was made in January of '61 that Shepard would be first. In the early days of Kennedy's administration, he restored some of the money that Eisenhower had vetoed at the end of his, but he made no promises to NASA as related to their future budgets. But then on April 12th, 1961, Soviet Air Force Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space and the first to orbit the Earth. For his part, Glenn said the Russian accomplishment was a great one, adding that he wished the US had made the first flight. As for the American space program, LBJ on April 20th, 1961, JFK instructed LBJ then to review the space program. He asked LBJ to look at the questions: do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space or by a trip around the moon? And back with the man, is there any other space program which promises dramatic results in which we can win? And the next morning at a press conference, Kennedy offered, if we can get to the moon before the Russians, we should. Gagarin's flight had moved the needle. It had taken away the voices of caution about the space program and put it more in the hands of the Cold Warriors. And NASA, had convinced Kennedy of the path forward. Rachel, if we could. I'm sorry, the next slide, please. And in a surprise address to Congress on May 25th, 1961, Kennedy said the nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The Mercury program, the following Gemini program, and the Apollo program go forward. Kennedy had bought into the space effort. Much more probably for the political gain and for the country's mood, as they felt that we were trailing the Russians badly. But at this point, Kennedy was beginning to buy into the space effort and what NASA was promising. Next, Rachel. So when John Glenn awoke at 1:30 a.m. on February 20th, 1962, ready to explore the mysteries of orbital spaceflight, he was optimistic. This might be the day. The weather forecast for the recovery zone was good, and meteorologists believed that the cloud cover at Cape Canaveral would break up by mid-morning. Since it had been announced on October 4th, 1961, that Glenn would be on the first orbital flight on the Mercury Atlas 6, there had been 10 flight delays. Most had been weather related. For example, on January 22nd, 1962, one day before a scheduled flight, technicians discovered that too much oxygen was being pumped into Glenn's spacesuit. As it turned out, the seal rings on his gloves had been installed backwards. NASA was too embarrassed by this fact to release that to the press, but it was one example of a flight delay. On January 27th, Glenn climbed into his capsule, only to lie on his back for 5 hours and 11 minutes, 1/2 hour longer than the flight was scheduled to be, before bad weather forced another scrub. Well, there'll be another day, Glenn told the flight crew. Glenn always had a good attitude to the press about flight delays, but years later, he admitted that the delays were huge letdowns. He was quoted as saying, when you go through all that and get ready and get yourself psyched up to go, then they cancel the flight and you have to get unstrapped, you get out and come down and try it all over again. It's a big disappointment. But on the day of the 5.5 hour flight delay, Glenn was sweaty, he was tired, he was unhappy, clearly. Back at the house, Annie Glenn was getting a phone call from Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson, and they were expressing their support after a long day, with the flight finally being scrubbed. And at this point, Lyndon Johnson wanted to come over and offer Annie some personal support. Now, Annie Glenn had suffered throughout her entire life with a bad stuttering problem. And she was in no mood that day to invite Johnson and his wife and the press over to her living room. So she refused to see the vice president. Word quickly got back to NASA about this. And having just stepped out of his spacesuit, Glenn was summoned into a conference room and urged by NASA to call his wife and have her change her mind on meeting the vice president. But an angry Glenn stood with his wife. He said to them, you call your press conference to announce that, and I'll call my press conference to announce that, and we'll see who comes out the best. If you would, Rachel. But today looked like it was a go. February 20th, 1962. This time you're going to go. This time, boy, you're going to take a ride. His project director, Walt Williams, told him at breakfast. Around 5 a.m., he suited up and took a short van ride to the launch pad. When he arrived, he sat in the van for an hour as there were 2 more short holds. And at 6 a.m., he emerged from the van, waving at the cameras and greeting the launch crew. He gazed up at the Atlas rocket. The white lights gave it an eerie bluish glow. Within minutes of taking the elevator ride to the top, Glenn slipped into the Friendship 7 capsule, as you can see in the picture here. He was quoted as saying, "You don't get into it, you put it on." That is the capsule. That's how small it was. During the Mercury program, the astronauts were allowed to name the capsules they were flying in, and John Glenn had given this task to his children, Lynn and Dave, to come up with a name for the capsule. His only guideline for them was to pick a name that should say something about America's role in the world as the whole world will be watching. And after much thought, John Glenn's children came up with the name Friendship 7. He sat in the capsule for 3 hours. Some small problems also occurred. His microphone broke off on his helmet, and they had to replace that. There was a bolt on the hatch that came apart, and it took the crew 40 minutes to repair that. But Glenn still was confident that liftoff was going to happen. And at 8 a.m., the clouds broke through and blue skies appeared, and Glenn could look up through his periscope and see the blue skies. At T-minus 4 minutes, all was a go at mission control, and Glenn grabbed hold of the abort handle. "Godspeed, John Glenn," fellow astronaut and friend Scott Carpenter said over the radio seconds before the launch. Now, John Glenn couldn't hear him. All John Glenn could hear was now the roar of the rocket coming to life and Alan Shepard counting down from 10. Rachel, if you would. And there's the launch of Friendship 7. The first 2 seconds, there was no movement at all, only noise. Then it rose. Calmly, Glenn said, "The clock is operating, we're underway." And it was 9:47 a.m. on the Florida coast. Back at the Glenn home, Annie Glenn sat on the floor, resting her head on her knees, and she wept. In the White House, John Kennedy, LBJ, and some congressional people sat around nervously around a television in the White House. "A little bumpy," John Glenn said right away. At 35,000 feet, the spacecraft was at what was called max Q, the most intense aerodynamic point of the journey. In 1960, an unmanned rocket had exploded exactly at that point. Coming into high Q a little bit, Glenn radioed, but in 30 seconds, he radioed back, "It feels good and it's smoothing out real fine." Soon Glenn was 40 miles high and climbing. At 2 minutes and 9 seconds into the flight, the 2 outboard engines were cut loose, and 1 remaining engine pushed Friendship 7 forward. Just past the 5-minute mark, the engines cut off and the Atlas separated from the capsule. Glenn was now in orbit. He was 100 miles high, traveling 17,500 miles per hour. NASA immediately announced the news. The Friendship 7 spacecraft is in orbit with John Glenn at the controls. The weight left his chest. He felt as if he was floating inside of his suit. "0 G and I feel fine," he told Mercury Control. "The capsule is turning around." Now, the Friendship 7 capsule has started its journey with its narrow end forward. Now it's swung 180 degrees to lead with its blunt end. And now Glenn was facing backwards, and he could look outside. "Oh," he said, "the view is tremendous." Rachel, if you would. Glenn was now cleared for 3 orbits. Each would take 88 minutes and 29 seconds. Time now began to move very quickly. He was already nearing the next tracking station in Bermuda and then to the Canary Islands. He had a list of tasks to do, systems to test, switches to check, observations to make, instrument readings to report. He was given a list of Earth landmarks to look for and to report on. He had been encouraged to continuously talk to his ground communication contacts on what he was seeing from space. He was instructed to do exercises to assess the effectiveness of weightlessness. Weightlessness delighted Glenn, and he felt none of the bad side effects that had been predicted. He was told to try and eat a little bit. At 41 minutes after liftoff, he was over the Indian Ocean. In darkness, after seeing the first of 4 sunsets that day, he flew over Australia and he saw a big pattern of lights below. The residents in the city of Perth, Australia, had left the lights on for Glenn in what he called one of the greatest thrills of the trip. And now over Australia, a sunrise occurred. Then through the window, he saw something unexpected. Quote, "I'll try to describe what I'm in here. I'm in a big mass of some very small particles that are brilliantly lit up, like they're luminescent. I've never seen anything like it. They looked like fireflies," he thought, and they went in every direction as far as he could see, floating in space alongside him as he went along. The fireflies appeared at each sunrise. The best guess later was some sort of vapor coming off the spacecraft, with the sunrise light hitting them just right. But soon after the fireflies, he noticed a little more of a troubling problem with the spacecraft. The capsule began skating to the right, much like a car that's out of alignment. The capsule would then fire some thrusters to get back to the left. And then it would happen again and happen again. There was no risk of the capsule slipping off course, but this was using up additional fuel, and it could possibly shorten the flight. Glenn decided to switch off the auto system and took control of the stick. He had always wanted to fly Friendship 7, and now he was. In another snafu, an unsuccessful attempt was made to speak to President Kennedy, but that didn't work. But now a much more ominous mystery was becoming apparent down on Earth. As Glenn began his second orbit, a warning light reading segment 51 was noticed by a technician at Mission Control and was now being confirmed by others. Al Shepard blinked in disbelief upon hearing the report. What the signal was saying was that Glenn's heat shield and landing bag had come loose. The shield, of course, was all that stood between Glenn and a fiery death as Friendship 7 re-entered the planet's atmosphere. Technicians began scrambling to find an answer for Flight Director Chris Kraft. Now, Kraft's gut was telling him that this was just a faulty signal, but he needed recommendations quickly on how to protect Glenn. Quickly, NASA and its contractors looked for answers. The debate was hushed, but heated. In the meantime, Kraft and Al Shepard had decided not to tell John Glenn about the problem. "He's got enough to do without worrying about this," Kraft said. A decision was made to leave the spacecraft's retro pack in place after firing. Now, the retro pack is a unit of 3 reverse thrusters meant to use to slow down the capsule at reentry. The entire retro package is then jettisoned normally from the capsule, thrusters, straps, and all. But now it was believed that by not jettisoning the retro pack, the straps holding it in place would help hold the heat shield in place if it had come loose. On his end, Glenn was in the dark. When a tracking station over the Indian Ocean told him to be sure to have his landing bag switch in the off position, he didn't ask any questions. The Canton Island tracking station radioed, "We have no indication that your landing bag might be deployed." Glenn asked, "Did someone report landing bag could be down?" "Negative," they replied. "We had a request to monitor this and ask if you heard any flapping." Glenn simply responded, "Negative." As Glenn entered his third orbit, Fellow astronaut Wally Schirra radioed him from California. "You look real good up there. I feel real good, Wally. No problems at all." Rachel, do we have another slide? There we go. Only a few pictures, of course, from inside the capsule at that time. But now back to the heat shield. Glenn needed to be put in the loop, if not all the way in. He was asked to put the landing bag switch into auto position to see if he got a light. Negative, he reported. In automatic position, did not get a light. Now the time came to fire the retro rockets to begin slowing the capsule down. Schirra now radioed, "John, leave your retro pack on through your pass over Texas." Do you read? For Glenn, this was the first direct evidence of a problem. "Roger," he replied. The rockets were now firing. "Retros are firing," Glenn reported. Then another reminder from Schirra, "Keep your retro pack on until you pass Texas." "That's affirmative," Glenn responded. But now the story had quickly changed on Earth. Kraft and Williams had decided to leave the pack on through the entire reentry. "We are recommending that you leave the retro package on through the entire reentry." Do you read? Glenn now was looking for answers. "This is Friendship 7. What is the reason for this? Do you have any reason? Over?" "Not at this time. Cape Flight will give you the reason for this action when you are in view." And Glenn simply responded, "Roger." As the ship began its fiery re-entry, Glenn felt a thump and saw an orange glow outside. Glenn recalled later, flaming pieces were breaking off and flying past the spacecraft window. "I thought the pieces might be part of the heat shield breaking off." But what he saw was the blazing destruction of the retro package. It was not designed, of course, for re-entry. When he emerged from the communication blackout, he reported a real fireball outside. But at 10,000 feet, the main parachute opened. "A beautiful sight," he reported. Last thing he did was hit the landing bag switch, which filled with air to cushion his impact. And Rachel, if you would, one more slide. "Here we go," he said. Then impact. 4 hours and 55 minutes since Scott Carpenter had wished him Godspeed. In those days, as you can see, the capsule was lifted up with a crane onto the deck of the recovery ship. When John Glenn first stepped onto the deck of the recovery ship, the USS Noah, a sailor painted footprints in white to mark the spot where he had stepped, just as the French had done in 1927 when Charles Lindbergh emerged from the Spirit of St. Louis. John Glenn was an American hero, and America was prepared to celebrate him. Rachel, if you would. Only moments after removing his spacesuit for a more comfortable flight suit and sneakers, as you can see in the photo there, Glenn took a call immediately from John Kennedy, congratulating him and letting Glenn know he would see him in Florida in a few days' time. But February 20th was far from over. Glenn now spent 2 hours with NASA dissecting the flight and undergoing medical evaluations, first on the Noah and then on board the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. Hours later, he was on a plane to Grand Turk Island for 2 days of more tests, debriefings, and finally some rest. Now, as far as those debriefings went, Glenn had his opportunity to have it out with NASA. He was not happy at all about not being told about the problem with the heat shield. He was furious with NASA and its directors, and Chris Kraft in particular, in the meeting shortly after he returned to Earth. He was maintained, and rightly so, that he should have been told, and any pilot should be told of any problems on board. He later said, even if a plane got completely out of control, I don't think it's an experienced pilot would panic at all. There would be no point to it. He would still be sitting there trying to figure out what to do right, up to the last minute. Glenn never got over not being told by NASA about the problem with the heat shield. Rachel, if you would. Now the celebration began. The first of many roaring crowds greeted Glenn and Vice President Johnson at Patrick Air Force Base on February 23rd, after a brief rest. Annie and the kids and John's parents had now joined them. The motorcade to Cape Canaveral quickly turned into a parade. An estimated 100,000 spectators lined the route in Florida. holding signs, throwing confetti. Rachel, next slide, please. At the Cape, President Kennedy arrived and a ceremony was held where speeches were given and medals were awarded to all the astronauts. Anthems were played by marching bands. As the day ended, the Glenn family finally took the opportunity to relax. A few days in Key West, relatively alone, but this was the quiet before the storm. Soon there would be nowhere to hide. At the end of the week, the Glenns were on board Air Force One with the president, the first lady, and their daughter, Caroline. At the White House, all the astronauts and their families, along with NASA officials, attended a reception. Rachel, next slide, please. Next, he climbed into the back of a convertible along with the other astronauts with a ride with John Kennedy to the US Capitol, where Glenn addressed a joint session of Congress. Humbly, he praised his fellow astronauts and all those who had played a role in the success of Friendship 7 and explained that this was just the beginning for the space program. At the end of another busy day, the Glenns returned to their home in Virginia, only to find 750 well-wishers, I should say, gathered around in their front yard. Rachel, next slide. March 1st in New York City, of course, outdid the rest. In 1927, 3 million New Yorkers had come out to cheer Lindbergh. Glenn drew 4 million. 3,500 tons of confetti and ticker tape streamed down from the Manhattan skyscrapers. Church bells tolled and marching bands played. A 2,000 guest luncheon followed at the Waldorf Astoria. The New York celebration had a horrible element to it, however, that was overlooked by many and overlooked in history that day. That morning, actually, 95 people had died in an American Airlines crash shortly after takeoff from what is now John F. Kennedy International Airport. At that time, it was the worst single airline disaster in US history. On the following day, however, the New York newspapers treated both stories equally on page 1. Next slide, please, Rachel. And 2 days later, John Glenn returned home to New Concord, Ohio. The parade began on Liberty Street and turned onto Main Street, passing Glenn Plumbing, his father's business. A crowd now waited for him in the physical education building at Muskingum College. The gym was being named for him. Across the quad, Annie had played the organ for her senior recital there. When John Glenn sat in his car listening to a news bulletin from Pearl Harbor. As the school president gave his speech, Glenn looked at the floor and shook his head. Of all the honors he had received, this was the one he just couldn't believe. At the end of his speech, Glenn smiled and said with a grin, when you people all leave, be sure and clean up my gym. And that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you for listening.
That was wonderful, Scott. I learned several new things I had no idea about, and I'm sure other people have too. Let me pull up the chat. Do we have any questions in the chat? Okay, if you have any questions, now is the time to put them in there. I will, I have one for Scott. So the preceding name for NASA was NACA, and I can't remember exactly what that was, but it was technology. I don't know, it was, you tell me, it was space as in technology, but less of a focus on space because we really didn't know what we were going for yet, right?
Right.
Up until 1958.
Right. Well, even there were a number of groups, you're right, that were, there was the President's Space Advisory Council, which wanted its claws into the space program. The military, the Air Force fought hard to have NASA be under its umbrella. These were things that John Kennedy had to battle with on who was going to get control. It was actually in 1960, NASA did not have an administrator at that time. Again, NASA was created, but there were 3 or 4 groups all wrestling for control of the space program. And in 1960, it was John Glenn who appointed James Webb, who now we famously know name is on the James Webb Space Telescope, which of course the library had a program on just last week. So that's when James Webb came into the picture. And he was among many that convinced Kennedy to put the space program for peaceful purposes. The idea that the military may gain control of the space program did not sit well in the end with Kennedy or many other for that matter that believed that the space program should always be a peaceful endeavor. So yes, there were many groups at that time pulling to get control of the program, with NASA eventually winning out there, thank goodness, of course. But James Webb had just entered the picture right at that time.
The reason I bring it up is because it seemed to me, because you were saying that Eisenhower wasn't interested in funding the program and cut it back dramatically. And I wonder, you know, in thinking about the space race with the Russians and, Sputnik going up, prior to that, am I right on this? That, and as evidenced by John Glenn and being a fighter pilot and a test pilot, it seems like the technology that was being looked at and worked on and tested had to do with speed or just pure science and defense, as opposed to competing internationally with the Russians to do space exploration. Was that Eisenhower's thinking, that this was something that wasn't really within our focus?
I think Eisenhower, and again, some authors, I believe the historian, I can't think of his first name, Brinkley, wrote a book.
Douglas Brinkley?
Yes, thank you. Douglas Brinkley wrote a book where he went to great efforts to try to, again, burnish Eisenhower's reputation as far as it went with the space program. And the space program, and after Sputnik, we actually launched many more satellites. The program was continuing, and mostly the program was continuing mostly at the pushing of Congress at the time. Many congressional leaders were more on board than, say, Eisenhower was at the time. So things were continuously still being done. There were certain programs where Eisenhower would show his frustration that he simply just was unable to be convinced about, if the money was worth the effort. So we had successes at the end of Eisenhower's administration and early on in Kennedy's administration. We had many dramatic failures too. And in the meantime, we had a Russian astronaut doing 17 orbits in space. We had a Russian vehicle being launched toward Venus from an already orbiting satellite, and we felt that we were losing and losing and losing. So we would have successes and failures. But in the end, with the urging of many people, many in Congress, fortunately, Kennedy was brought on board, and again, I think Kennedy saw it as a very political thing. This was the coldest time of the Cold War, if you will, at that time. He had just come out of the Bay of Pigs, a disaster for his administration. He needed things to go well, but I think most people believe that when Kennedy died, when he was murdered in 1963, that he was fully on board with the space program and its efforts to get to the moon. He made many visits down to the launch sites where he was shown engine tests by Wernher von Braun and those types of people, and really got on board at that time. So yeah, it was an incredible time, deep into the Cold War, so much going on. But really, John Glenn is the person, I think, with his efforts on Friendship 7 that became a true American hero. We had a man who was handsome. He you could tell he was deeply loved his wife. He worshipped his God, and he served his nation in war. I mean, he was the perfect hero at that time for the space program to go forward and for the nation as a whole to get behind it.
I know we were talking yesterday about John Glenn being the last American hero, and you and I kind of speculated as to why he feels that way to us and why he feels that way kind of to America. And I think it's for all of those reasons.
Yeah.
But you had an interesting spin on it, that since then, when you see a ticker tape parade, it's not one person.
Right.
It's a group. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's a good time to certainly acknowledge the books I used to prepare this program. I definitely want to give credit where credit is due. One of them was called Mercury Rising, by Jeff Cecil, and I'm sure the library can help you with this. It's an amazing book about the flight and John Glenn, and also a lot about Kennedy. And the other book is a book called The Last American Hero, by an author named Alice George. And the subtitle of her book, it's called The Last American Hero, the Remarkable Life of John Glenn. And the title, The Last American Hero, at the time raised some eyebrows because, and I believe it was published just a few years ago. It raised some eyebrows as, really, he was our last American hero? That can't be right. And certainly we would hope for more in the future, right? We can't definitely say that he was the last American hero, but in many ways, it may be true, and in the sense that it was one man who was being celebrated. And Don and I are both old enough. Sorry me for using you, Donna, as the other old person in the room.
Well, I'm older, so it's okay.
But he was celebrated, as you could see, with that ticker tape parade in New York City. One man. The Apollo 11 astronauts, whose anniversary is tomorrow, yes, they were celebrated as heroes, but there were three of them sitting together in the back of that convertible in New York City. Certainly, we had hundreds of true heroes on 9/11, for example. But it was a different time, and if you're old enough to remember back, as Donna and I are, to one man, to a person who was appearing everywhere, being celebrated on the cover of Time magazine and Life magazine and things like that, and being seen on TV and brought to the White House and standing with the president. We celebrate our sports teams as heroes, and we continue to have heroes. We had many heroes from World War II and other wars, but this. It was different, and I can't recall in my lifetime since then of a single person with that much attention put to him by the country as a whole. And I think that's what she was talking about in that title, the time we were in then, and would we ever again, in the new times we live in, celebrate one man as a hero like that. We hope for many more heroes, obviously, but to the celebration, the recognition of John Glenn, that seemed to be unique for the time and has been unique ever since, at least I think in my opinion, and obviously in the opinion of the author.
Did Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom also get ticker tape parades?
It was not as, they weren't as, they did. And Alan Shepard was brought to the White House, and famously, as John Kennedy was pinning a medal on him, Kennedy dropped the medal, it fell on the ground, and he said, "This medal goes to you from the ground up," and it got a chuck crowd. They were, but not like Glenn, not at all like Glenn. There was a magic around this, and NASA was always very good at playing the magic game with the program for public relations purposes. Grissom had troubles. If we recall, his capsule the Liberty Bell 7, and all of the capsules on the Mercury flights were followed by a 7, in recognition of the 7 original astronauts, in case you're wondering. But Grissom had trouble after splashdown and blew a hatch. Some say prematurely, and and lost the capsule. It sank to the bottom of the ocean. So he kind of lost his chance there for a huge party too. But no, not the same as of course Glenn had received. It's funny in the book, you can when John Glenn and his wife got home that night, I talked about there were 3 huge mail bags on the living room floor that they had already gotten from people, and they were told by the post office that there's 3 more trucks full of bags waiting at the post office for them. They would receive letters of all the people who named their babies after John Glenn. Hundreds and hundreds from all over the world were naming their babies John Glenn Smith or whatever the case may be. So it's just amazing the recognition and the adulation that Glenn received, unmatched.
Could a factor that he, of course, his reputation as a war hero probably went a long way too, and his so well liked in his community and recognized. But do you think another factor for the accolades for John Glenn at this parade at this time could have been that when Alan Shepard went up and Gus Grissom went up, they did not, am I right on this? They did not orbit. And Yuri Gagarin had orbited, and this gave us a chance to at least catch up.
Right, and of course Gagarin had, and Shepard did not orbit, and neither did Grissom. They were simply up and down flights, and Gagarin had already orbited, so it was truly a first for the American. Of course, Shepard's was a first to reach space, but the orbit was for some reason was the one that, of course, more captivated America. But yeah, I think you're right. I think the fact that Gagarin had done it, and I believe, I might be wrong about this, but I'll take a shot at it. Why not? I believe they had also put another person in space after Gagarin, the Russians, that is. So yeah, something dramatic was needed, not just an up and down flight, and the orbit was, of course, that. And of course, like we mentioned, Glenn had already by this time become somewhat of a national celebrity, appearing on game shows and things like that prior to Friendship 7, with his speed record flight earlier. So already a well-known, and always was the of all the Mercury 7 astronauts, he early on stood out from the rest. And it may have frustrated some of the other astronauts with his good boy nature and the way he presented himself, and all those things. You can see video press conferences with all the other astronauts, give them their kind of short answers, and John Glenn would go on about God and country and duty and things like that. And at that time, Donna, you probably remember that the American public, that's what they wanted. That's what it was then. Again, during a terribly dangerous time in the world at the height of the Cold War. America needed a hero like John Glenn, and as I described him at the end there, he was the perfect hero. And it wasn't a show. Just looking back at his life, all those things we acknowledged, in the beginning, that he had accomplished in his life, and the way he was raised by his family, honor God, country, that stuff was real. It wasn't made up. It wasn't a put on. It's who the man was. He died at 95 years old. I think his wife Annie actually lived to 100, outliving him. Just an incredible, phenomenal life. I really enjoyed researching this and gaining the knowledge. Something really, everybody can look into. I know that I also had a chance to look at a couple documentaries on PBS. I would encourage folks to go, to YouTube and look at those. It's really amazing, the life that this man had led. And that day, the Friendship 7, although it only lasted a few hours, really, really grabbed America.
Well, it was a remarkable life and a remarkable story. It's a wow, and you're right about July being Space Geek Month. I know there's going to be a lot of retro tomorrow about the moon landing. Rachel has some saved up, so, watch our website. There'll be some links. We will also link the 2 books that you mentioned, Scott, so that people can look for those. They are in the library system. We do not have our copies on the shelf, but they will be soon. So watch for those books. And, there's so much to know about NASA that if there's anything that I can say is the downfall of all their wonderful public information is that there's so much of it, it's almost overwhelming. But yeah, there's lots to know. And Scott, I hope we can count on you to do many other programs for us in the future. And, especially we have Artemis coming up, and we have another program that I've already asked Scott to do. What's up at NASA? What's new at NASA?
What's up at NASA? Get it, Donna?
What's up at NASA? Okay, I get it. Okay.
Look up in the sky.
All right. And so we're going to be scheduling that. So I hope you all will join us for that. And I don't think we have anything in the chat right now. No? Okay. So with that, I'm going to let everybody go on time tonight. Thank you to our audience for attending. And I hope you've all enjoyed the program as much as I have. A recording of this program will be available on the library website tomorrow, along with a recording of last week's NASA program, Hidden Universe, about the James Webb Space Telescope that Scott referenced earlier. Also, please, once again, complete the short pop-up survey that appears when we close the Zoom connection. We always value your input. And Scott, I'll turn it back over to you for closing comments.
Well, again, just thank you, Donna. You've helped me along the way here in this wonderful new journey, I guess, of my own. And I know the library is a big supporter of these things, and especially Donna and Rachel and their interest and excitement, as I have with NASA. So hopefully more things to come in the future. So we'll see you then.
All right. And thank you, Scott. And thank you to our audience. Look up, see the stars, and good night.